have been hosted by many design studios or companies that share our values, our beliefs, and our mindset. So we have hosted before different formats such as talks, panel discussions, activities, and even workshops. We are sponsored by Zebra People, which we thank massively for their support all the time. They are a dynamic recruitment agency. So in case you are looking for new positions for any reason now, current or maybe in the future, please get in touch with them. They will be able to help you. So before diving into tonight's talks, we would like to briefly give you a preview of the next event we will have in a few weeks on Monday, the 10th of August. So it will be a conversation with Mark Fontaine. Basically, we want to create a nice conversation about the intersection between design thinking and service design. So Mark will be happy to basically answer the questions that we will collect through our social media platform. So please feel free to post questions if you have them. We also opened a Slido with the event code 10410, so 10410. So feel free to post the questions there, and during the night, Mark will be kind of having a conversation while answering questions for you. So upcoming to tonight, we will have two talks by David Cook and Liz Citron. Then we will have some Q&A. So first the two talks, then Q&A, which will collect in this Zoom chat here. So feel free to post any questions that you want, and then we will have a quick wrap up. So let me introduce Dave and Liz. So Dave Cook is an anthropologist, psychologist, and UX specialist. He co-founded the design consultancy What People Want back in 2002. Prior to that, he was European Head of Experience Design at the global agency Razorfish, and was launch editor at the BBC Online in 1997. So Dave is a remote work specialist, and his writing has appeared on the BBC News, The Guardian, The Independent, The Telegraph, World Economic Forum, and The Conversation. His current research at UCL focuses on digital nomads and the work practices and routines that they require to sustain work-life balance in a rapid changing and uncertain world as we are living now. Then we have Liz Citron, after 25-year digital career, helping a wide variety of organizations create easy-to-use software. Liz Citron now supports people in the industry to navigate their careers and discover what is holding them back so they can find their path to happiness at work. So how exciting. Before starting, just a very brief etiquette for the evening. Add your Zoom so everyone knows who you are. Mute yourself during the talks, but then if you want to ask openly some questions, please unmute yourself. Use the Zoom chat, as I said before. Jason and Carmen will help to collect the questions in there. Please be specific who you want to address the question to, so if it's Liz or Dave, and give Dave and Liz your full attention and enjoy. So a big welcome to Dave and Liz, our speakers for tonight. So Dave, I can stop sharing and I'll leave you sharing your screen. So as you might have seen in our meetup event description, Dave suggested to watch a couple of films. I'm not sure if it's kind of. Can you share it now?
Yeah, I can just talk about those later.
Yeah, exactly. So just he will introduce. If you haven't managed, I was saying to watch them. Don't worry too much. He will give a brief introduction during his talk. So enjoy.
Okay, thank you very much for that lovely, generous introduction. I'm just going to get my slides up and share my screen there so that I think that everyone can see them. I think that's all there. So, yeah, well, thank you very much for inviting me on to Design Thinking London. Good evening. As Lou just said, my name is Dave Cook, and I'm an anthropologist from University College London, UCL. And also the co-founder of design consultancy What People Want, which has been running for about 18 years. So I'm going to spend quite a lot of time talking about anthropology and social science tonight, but my other identity is as a creative, and I started my career studying design at the Royal College of Art quite a long time ago, but I do have these two identities. But today I'm going to talk to you about digital nomads, and I've been conducting research on this type of remote worker for more than 5 years. And this research is unique in having some insight into what happens to remote work over months and years. And I think we're, some of us are beginning to experience that right now. And so just to tell a little personal story about how I came to be talking about this in the public domain. In March this year, in March 2020, which seems like a decade ago now, I very quietly published an academic paper on this niche type of remote worker called digital nomads. And I've been researching them for half a decade. And in March, although the remote working experience was being talked about as a rising trend, it wasn't exactly headline news. And before COVID-19, attitudes to remote working were quite mixed and uneven. Companies and employers tended to be firmly against remote working, or at least suspicious of it. And even those more accepting of remote working, it was still often viewed as an inferior type of work, an indulgence, perhaps, or not proper work. And I hear that quite a lot in my research. And I didn't expect many non-specialists to read the journal paper that I published. And in the days that followed, the twin concepts of remote work and working from home exploded into a global conversation. So I'd spent half a decade silently collecting and organizing our data, hardly speaking to anybody outside of this research project. And then suddenly I was writing articles, giving news interviews, and getting pulled into COVID-19 projects. And I quickly learned that this urgent global conversation was triggered by a lack of everybody being prepared. And very few were ready for this instantaneous global remote work revolution. So there's just a few articles, examples of some of the articles that I wrote here up on the screen. So before I start, I'm just going to have a really clumsy attempt at trying to explain to everybody what a digital nomad is, because when I do these talks, sometimes everybody knows or nobody knows, but it's sometimes best if I just go in and try and give a quick explanation. So they're often written about in the media, and the stereotype of a digital nomad is a millennial knowledge worker that posts Instagram stories from exotic locations like Bali and Thailand. But a lot of digital nomads spend quite a lot of time debating what it actually means as a term. So in order to arrive at a definition, I actually asked people as part of this research. So what we have on the screen here is a vertical axis where at the top of the vertical axis we have work focus, at the bottom it's non-work, and then to the left of the horizontal axis we have high mobility, moving around a lot, and then on the other side, on the right side, we have low mobility. And from all of the discussions that I had, this pattern emerged. So digital nomads tended to put themselves in the work-focused category and highly mobile category. Down here, you've got tourists who, still in today's world, try and not work whilst they're traveling, but, they're sometimes quite mobile. We've got non-working expats here, backpackers over here. I think you kind of get the gist. This is a presentation all on its own, so I won't go into it, and I can answer more questions about this in the questions at the end, but hopefully this gives you an idea. And of course, the debate continues. So today I'm going to focus on what we can learn from digital nomads as people who were trying to work remotely full-time before COVID-19. So the first insight I'm going to share, and I don't know if people are going to agree or not, is that remote working is hard work. And so digital nomads, like a lot of people, I think, at the beginning of lockdown, were initially excited to work from home or work remotely. And during this study, more than 90% of the nomads that I encountered gave up on the lifestyle in the first year. There were a myriad reasons for this, but one of the reasons is that remote work is hard, which I'll dig into a little bit more later. But there are skills that are not obvious that it's important to learn if you're going to do this successfully. So let's explore some of the reasons behind why digital nomads actually attempt the lifestyle in the first place, what the triggers are. So this was the easiest research question to answer on this research project. And although it was quite hard to come up with a precise definition of digital nomads, it was quite easy to uncover why people were attempting to become one. So most of the digital nomads I spoke to, who once had traditional office jobs, told me that they were escaping deeply rooted problems in the contemporary workplace. So commuting was always at the top of the list, high cost of living in global cities like London, New York, San Francisco, Berlin, or rejection of office life. So we've got this gratuitous animated GIF, which did the rounds a few years ago, just to demonstrate that really subtly. And before COVID-19, these cultural attitudes had increasingly been a trigger for protests. I mean, in 2009, after the financial global crash, and a focus for think tanks such as the Resolution Foundation, who publish a lot of papers, and they're very concerned that living standards and the taken for granted economic freedoms are continually being eroded. And of course, as we emerge from national lockdowns and unprecedented global job losses, these arguments are just getting louder. So right now, we find ourselves in a position where concepts which were not even being talked about before lockdown and before remote working in March are suddenly on the table. So remote work and the end of commuting, well, I'm going to say sorry, employers, but the genie is out of the bottle on that one. Most people are saying that they don't want to commute all the time. And I think the conversation has changed, because if employers want to haul workers back into the office every day, the onus is now on them to provide a compelling case for putting people through this kind of like daily drag every day, and currently risking their lives. And other examples include the shorter work week, whether that's 4 days, 3 days, or 15 hours, and also universal basic income. And people are increasingly asking, why are we only just beginning to talk about this precarity and dissatisfaction now? Why did it take a pandemic? And writers and thinkers are increasingly asking why. Why has technology been sold to us as labour-saving devices that offer the promise of control and flexibility and only make us work harder and longer? So just a couple of examples here. There's a sociologist at the London School of Economics, Judy Wiseman, who writes about this acceleration culture, and also Melissa Masmanian, who is arguing that, you know, to some extent we're becoming worker smartphone hybrids. And another anthropologist, in his article on called Bullshit Jobs, David Graeber, also at the London School of Economics, wrote an article in 2014 on the subject of bullshit jobs. And in this article, he demanded to know why the changes still hadn't happened. And he's a bit of an activist, and I really like his voice. So I'm going to read out this quote. You know, and hopefully we can all reflect on this. So, unquote, in the year 1930, John Maynard Keynes predicted that by century's end, technology would have advanced sufficiently that countries like Great Britain or the United States would have achieved a 15-hour work week. There is every reason to believe that he was right. In technological terms, we're quite capable of this, and yet it didn't happen. Instead, technology has been marshaled, if anything, to figure out ways to make us all work more. The moral and spiritual damage that comes from this situation is profound. It's a scar across our collective soul, yet no one talks about it. I think you can see what I mean by his activist voice. I really like the way that he speaks and the way that he writes. And as we emerge from lockdown, people are beginning to talk about some of these previously unmentionable ideas and to ask, what happened to all of that flexibility that we were promised? And I think this is a question we have to ask ourselves every day. So this brings me back to digital nomads, and it also brings me back to the remote working experience during COVID-19, and to ask the question, what is actually happening here? How is it that the digital nomad dream, you know, to take their story, their dream of freedom starts off as an attempt to escape from commuting and from the office, and then over time, digital nomads, they go to Bali, they go to Thailand, and then they find themselves working in co-working spaces, and they're actually recreating mini commutes. And that's one of the things that emerged on my research. So in this picture, we can see the difference between the digital nomad dream and the digital nomad reality. So at the top, we have the stereotype of the digital nomad that you've seen a couple of times in previous slides. And the picture below is nearer to the reality. So in order for digital nomads to survive, many end up working in these co-working spaces, which are essentially rebranded offices. And we've seen similar paradoxes in the COVID-19 remote work experience. And because there's no up-to-date or very little up-to-date longitudinal overtime studies on remote work, I was asked to team up with the brain sciences faculty at UCL to help research what the remote work experience was really like during COVID-19. And I've been conducting hour-long interviews all throughout the last 3 months. And the biggest insight to come out of this study is that many people were initially excited to experience remote work, but over time, the reality became difficult and draining, especially if people didn't put in time, effort, and discipline into creating effective strategies to separate their work life and their home life. And I heard this time and time again in interviews, and it also came out in the survey data. We ran a survey, and people usually start off by saying that they're coping a lot better than they expected. And then there's this single quote that keeps on rattling around in my brain that one participant shared with me a few weeks ago, which I think sums all of this up. And she said, "I'm actually surprised. I've managed fine, much better than I expected. But remote working like this out of a 1-bedroom flat in London has not been a good quality existence." Now, maybe some of this sounds familiar to people. So remote working often starts out as this exciting dream and ends up becoming about managing the boundaries between work life and home life. And I think we're all experiencing that now. And this is where the experiences of digital nomads and remote workers during COVID-19 really start to merge. So over time, feelings of autonomy and freedom give way to what I call the invisible work of being responsible for your own routine, struggling to manage distractions, learning how to focus and manage multiple communication channels. We're all doing this right now. You know, I'm just getting used to presenting in this way. It's weird. And to use these things in different ways. And being entirely self-reliant can become exhausting over time. And the entire concept of personal responsibility is also a deeply political idea. And I'm just going to give a little detour, a little bit of history, and people can ask me questions about this or agree or disagree with me. So in 2005, in his party conference speech, the then Prime Minister Tony Blair warned us that globalization was unforgiving of frailty, no respecter of past reputations, it has no custom or practice. Now, if he'd said that today, he could have been describing today's gig economy, and he was certainly describing the world that digital nomads work in today. And Tony Blair was, of course, not only talking about globalization, he was also talking about this much used, bandied about word called neoliberalism. And when Margaret Thatcher, who many see as one of the key architects of neoliberalism, was asked, what is your biggest achievement? She famously quipped, New Labour, and she really wasn't joking. I mean, this is a project that kind of like spans different political parties and different political agendas. So basically, the main definition of neoliberalism, and there are a few, but one of the most popular is that its core aim is to dismantle the state and state regulations in favour of free market control. So basically, the idea of personal responsibility equals freedom equals neoliberalism is almost the common sense way of thinking about the world at the moment. And this utopian digital nomad narrative is entirely built on these ideas. So when I've been conducting my research in these digital nomad hotspots, there are very often conferences, and people at these conferences are often asked to chant things like, I want freedom. And I'm just going to play a little clip from one of these conferences. It's about 5-6 seconds long, and then maybe we can talk about it in the questions.
All those bosses that you hated. Think of all those cold mornings getting out of bed. 1, 2, 3. Welcome to Nomad Summit 2019.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like a political rally to me. So I find that a really interesting clip, and I'll be interested to find out what people think about that. But in my research with digital nomads, it's been important to critically evaluate what freedom means. So for some, freedom might be the ability to travel. For others, to travel and grow a business. Yet for others, freedom might mean access to universal healthcare. So, you know, my freedom isn't the same as your freedom. And in my research on digital nomads, I've seen what happens when over years, they have to take responsibility for almost every aspect of their modern life, their mental health, daily routine, income, safety and shelter. And the reality is that being a completely free, autonomous citizen of the world can be extremely draining. As one of my research participants explained to me, digital nomads can quickly become isolated and unaccountable, but they don't notice it happening at the time necessarily. So here we can begin to see some overlaps, some more overlaps between the digital nomad experience and the working from home experience, which we're only at the, many people are only at the beginning of. So as I've hinted quite a few times today, too much freedom and flexibility can actually become a burden. And when faced with burdens, people tend to develop coping strategies. And both digital nomads and remote workers that I've interviewed during COVID-19 have started to develop these self-regulation strategies so that they can experience some semblance of work-life balance. So we have an example of a recent article that I wrote about this, which I can share if people are interested after this. But examples of these strategies include boundary rituals. I mentioned creating imaginary mini commutes, scheduling downtime in people's work calendars to prevent overwork. I'm sure most of us have done that at some point. Agreeing email and communication behaviors and etiquette so that people can understand that they're working with people who have different competing needs sometimes and different views about what flexibility means. My flexibility is not the same as your flexibility. So these and dozens of other strategies that I've researched all take work and effort and time to learn. And some people really hate this burden of invisible work or would simply prefer to go back into an office. And this is precisely why digital nomads end up going across the world and then into co-working spaces. And performing perfection, performing happiness, let's just talk a little bit about that. Digital nomads spend a lot of time and effort curating and performing happiness. And they're not the only ones, I guess. As one participant told me, it's like living in Instagram 24/7 when you're a digital nomad. Another quote from a participant, she explained to me, this was in 2017, there's a danger that when my aunt looks at Instagram and sees that everything looks so happy here on the beach, of course, my digital identity always looks happier than my life is. So we've seen similar performances during lockdown, for example, with homeschooling. So most parents I've spoken to during COVID-19 research have really struggled to homeschool and do homeworking in the same space. And I've spoken to quite a few people that have even asked to be furloughed. One of either the mum or the dad has asked to be furloughed because it's become too much. And as one dad told me recently, post sharing Mary Poppins-like pictures of the perfect homeschooling experience was just too much to bear. So I had to come off Facebook. I don't know if people have seen these kind of COVID homeschooling schedules, but they make some people want to vomit. So blogs and articles on remote work best practices are useful, but they can also backfire and be counterproductive. And the flip side to taking on all of this responsibility and managing all of this remotely is burnout. And I know that Liz is going to talk about how we can manage, resilience and sort of get better at doing some of these things without shaming others. Now, at the beginning, it was mentioned that I'd put forward a couple of suggested films to watch. Don't worry if you didn't see them, I'll give a quick overview. So the two movies are American Factory and Sorry We Missed You. And you might be thinking, what on earth do these films have to do with digital nomads or working from home during COVID-19? And in case you haven't watched them, American Factory is a documentary about a Chinese takeover of an American glass factory. But what it's really about is what happens to remote workers when unions are dismantled and all state protections are stripped away and worker rights are laid bare to the mercies of globalization and neoliberalism. And that one's a documentary. Sorry We Missed You is a fictional movie by Ken Loach, and it's based on Amazon delivery drivers. And it explores what happens to workers when they're forced to work on zero-hour contracts or set themselves up as small businesses. So they're just accounts of what can happen when worker protections are stripped away and people are forced to work without the safety net of a proper work contract. Now, in the creative and UX industries, many choose, myself included in the past, to work flexibly and freelance. And I think, the difference that we should be thinking about is we shouldn't be forced to be freelance. And if we choose to be freelance, that we're treated correctly and we aren't exploited. And there can be a fine line between flexibility and precarity. And post COVID-19, life, I think, may feel more precarious than usual for many of us. So I'm drawing to a close now. I'm just going to make some concluding, sort of like thoughts. why do people reject the office and then, travel across the world and look for new ones? That always fascinated me. It took me ages to answer that question in my research. Why did they end up going to co-working spaces, which is essentially a rebranded office? And I'm going to give another quote in the words of a digital nomad participant to my question: why do you go into a co-working space? The reply I thought was extraordinary at the time. I didn't understand it. So this person said, why would I work from my apartment all day, not being able to focus, when I can outsource all my lack of self-discipline to a co-working space? Really weird way to kind of like describe a problem. But actually, once we got about 3 weeks into lockdown, and I went through and I saw this in my field notes, I suddenly understood it. I realized, that's why somebody would want to outsource, something, to something novel like a co-working space. This idea that an office is a luxury or even a new idea to some people. And productivity and structure, I think we're all finding when we have to manage these, they're very important. But I think that we also have to be empathetic to other people and also to ourselves, and realize that productivity isn't the most important thing in life and work. So this is a photo that I took at a Digital Nomad conference in 2016. And the person on stage is actually giving a presentation about her calendar management skills and how she plans her year. I thought this was an extraordinary thing to do a conference presentation on. The day I witnessed this, a little bit part of my soul died, actually. So I guess the question I'm asking, if we're all going to be pulled into all of this invisible work, we need to have an honest and frank discussion about it. We need time so we can be allowed to be amazing designers, amazing service designers, creative, and UX folk. So, looking to the future, we need to think about how we support ourselves in an increasingly precarious work environment. And, Liz is going to discuss some of these strategies in her upcoming presentation. And as well as building resilience within ourselves, I think, what I'm saying, I'm asking people to do is to engage with wider discussions about how and why the world of work is changing. So, the first thing we can do is continue to support communities of practice like Design Thinking London. These are really important things to be involved in. Let's discuss different working practices. Let's talk about universal basic income. Let's talk about the shorter working week. And I just popped this in just before I did the presentation today. Uber drivers are taking Uber to the Supreme Court in America so that they can understand how the algorithm for the Uber app works. So it doesn't force them to take on too many jobs, drive dangerously, live a precarious life. And, looking forward, why not take it a step further and start to draw up charters about how freelancers should be treated? There is actually a freelancers union with over 60 million members in America. We don't have one here in the UK. Maybe we should. And if we continue with these conversations and ask ourselves what our own, personal precarity might be after COVID and beyond, I think that's going to be a really interesting thing that we can learn and take out of lockdown. So that's enough talking for me. If you want to contact me about my remote work research, you can contact me on Twitter. I am Dave Cook. The UCL project is eworklife.co.uk. And if you want to talk to me about UX consultancy, you can email me at dave@whatpeoplewant or go to whatpeoplewant.com. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing that now.
Right, we have a few questions.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, do you want to do the questions now or we take them later at the end?
The idea was actually to take them later, but we can freestyle if we want to have questions, you know, like maybe like burning questions today, right now. I'm not sure. I mean, up to the speakers, I guess.
I can go either way. I will leave it to Design Thinking London to and decide, and also to Liz.
So we leave it to Liz. What do you prefer?
Absolutely fine with me. Go right ahead. Don't worry. Yes, let's hear the questions.
Perfect, thank you. So, John, would you like, you have a couple of questions. If you want to ask yourself.
Yeah, hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
I can.
We can.
Excellent. Well, I just made a couple of comments. I thought it was really interesting. Thank you very much. The first one was just whether any of the behaviors you see, obviously there's all sorts of dimensions, all sorts of interesting things you've seen, but is there a dimension of introversion versus extroversion, and perhaps juniorness versus seniority? So the first one is probably quite interesting. The second one is, well, I've been a business owner for like 20 years, and I'm quite used to being on 24/7 and thinking about things and having all of that pressure and that self-responsibility. I just wonder if there's a level of kind of seniority that means that some people, once they reach a certain level, are therefore more, I guess, trained to be a successful digital nomad. And then the final comment I made was just about actually what you said about the person outsourcing their distractions or whatever to the co-working space. That really reminded me of students who used to go to the library to pretend to read books and revise and stuff. And actually we're just doing it because that's where the social swirl is, and that's where the good excuse is.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to get comments on those things, and thanks very much for the talk.
Yeah, no, that's a pleasure. Really, really good questions. I'm going to answer the question about introversion and extroversion first of all, because then I go into this in quite a lot of detail in the research paper that I published in March, just a few months ago, and I'll share that because it's open access. But one of the things that I found on that research is that a lot of the digital nomads that I found, at the conferences at the beginning of their journey, were very excited. They wanted to go to, to these places. They wanted to cooperate and collaborate with people, and I noticed that this is why it's been really fascinating following people over half a decade, because over time, some people started, sort of like having their, their Zoom calls or their video conferences. Zoom wasn't around so much 5 years ago, and then turning the video off. And then they would move and then have more asynchronous communication. So over time, because these people are working in remote locations in Thailand and Bali, they're at the ends of these transnational spokes. And once people stopped using, synchronous forms of communications like video meetings and then turning the video off, they started to become more introverted over time. And then, for some of my participants, that became very tightly enmeshed with feeling isolated and feeling burnt out. So that does emerge over time. So if you are going to be working from home, I would very, very strongly recommend that you try to keep your daily routines, try to keep the cameras switched on when you can. You can't do it all of the time, but there can be a kind of like a long tail of introversion that creeps up on you. So I think that would probably make sense to quite a lot of people. Yes, in terms of seniority and autonomy, I've seen this a lot in the research that I've been conducting during COVID-19 over the last few months. So I was actually on a panel last week, and everybody was talking about loving, planning, all of their own time and all of their own tasks. And I had to say, well, actually, a lot of people on here, they're London-based, they're quite senior, they're creative. Let's not make the presumption that everybody wants to sort of like live in a world without structure, and they have to create all of the structure themselves. So when we have those conversations, and if we are employers, let's think about that. There's really interesting research specifically into video calling. Even with faster internet and better platforms like Zoom, when there's less of a lag, there is still a lag. But when there's even a millisecond of lag, it reduces people's trust because they think that they're not being listened to. And this really builds into people's idea, especially senior people, of talking all the time and not allowing more junior people, to come in and join into the conversation. So, those are kind of like two evidence-based answers to two really amazing questions. I'm actually designing a research study at the moment, which is looking at this correlation between, how helpful is structure and, self-structure, and how, helpful is autonomy, in the workplace, in the creative industries here in London.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we can carry on with Liz, and maybe we do have a few other questions in the chat, but we can just carry on with Liz's presentation and then ask and compile everything at the end.
Okay.
So over to you, Liz.
Hello, sorry, I have the usual screen sharing goings on. Right, hello, I'm Liz Citron. I was just before I introduce myself anymore, I just want to say, I just thought that Dave's talk was really amazing and eye-opening, and really, really good food for thought, and not an easy act to follow. So I'll do my best. As Lou said right at the beginning, I've been in digital for a very long time, and I started my career at the Guardian newspaper in the early 90s, when they were trying to figure out what this new media stuff was and whether it was important to them. And since then, I worked at a lot of really amazing places, from the BBC, lots and lots of design agencies. And most recently, I was in a government department at the Ministry of Justice. And in the last couple of years, I've changed my focus from helping organizations find their way in the digital world to helping individuals find their way in their careers. And the reason I did that is because I was inspired by the challenges I found while I was managing teams myself, seeing how frustrated and unhappy people were with the progress they were making at work. And so as a coach, I help people understand themselves better in order to achieve their goals. So just to give a sort of a bit of background about what I'm going to be talking about is, Dave was talking about a huge range of things, but he was really touching on sort of practical coping strategies that people use to make sense of remote work, however they experience it. But my focus is really about giving you psychological support to help build resilience and help you deal with the sort of ups and downs of life. And as we know, in the last 6 months, our whole worlds, each of us, our worlds have really changed a lot. And it's not been one change, it's been a sort of a wave after wave of change, in a way, for each of us. And my favorite quote on the experience of lockdown is that we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. And so each person's really had, each of us have had a different experience of coronavirus. But, back in January, I think it's fairly safe to say that most of us thought it was a faraway disease that really wouldn't impact on us at all. And it wasn't until March, really, when it started moving into our reality. And then very quickly, we went into lockdown. And then lockdown is, slowly been lifted until, a couple of weeks ago, it was, effectively lifted enough to make us have a glimpse of normality. But it's been a very turbulent experience for most of us. So in terms of, just sort of covering some of the experiences that people have had, is the whole concept of working from home has been very challenging for some of us. You know, some of us live in small homes. We don't necessarily have great broadband, you know, when you're trying to homeschool and get work done. And so the whole working from home has potentially been very challenging for people. And I've heard a lot of sad stories, especially at the beginning of lockdown, where people had resigned from their position, not knowing that we were having a crisis looming, and taken up a new job, and then being caught midly where the offers were withdrawn. So people had accidentally made themselves unemployed, or the situation had impacted them in that way. And then we've had a lot of contracts sort of terminated, or being not the same as they used to be. So it's impacted people really a lot, sort of financially, in terms of their confidence about themselves, and and then you've got the furlough status, which from the outside, as someone who's not been furloughed, it looks quite nice to be paid to not go to work. But actually, the reality is that, there's potentially an axe hanging over your head. You don't know whether, there's a job to go back to. So, that's been an experience for people. And then some people have just completely fallen through the net. There are certain types of employment that weren't covered by some of the support the government offered. And now we're going back into this, returning to work, and children are returning to school, and there's a lot of challenges associated with all of that. So a nice lens to look at it through is something that you may or may not be familiar with, which is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief model. And it came from her research done in the 60s, where she was understanding the experience of people and their families who, the individuals were approaching death, and the experience that they and their families went through. And she found that there was a really strong pattern and a cycle of behavior and thinking. And of course, when it was published, people very quickly realized that it maps perfectly to any kind of experience where unwelcome change happens. So that could be experiencing disability, going through redundancy, divorce, financial problems. And the experience of it isn't at all linear. So you can go through all 5 stages of grief in a day. You can stay in one stage for months. You can. It's not a clear thing that you absolutely come out of the end of it. It's a very circular experience for most people. And the first phase is denial, and Dave talked about that a little bit as well, is that at first it all seems really fun. This is, it's not serious, nothing really bad is going to happen. It'll be over soon. It's not so bad. I know with my neighbors, when we first went into lockdown, we had a WhatsApp group, and there was a lot of exchanging of flour and things like that. And it was all a bit of a lark at first. And that unfortunately, that phase is not one you cycle back through. So you have denial, and then you tend to leave that behind you. And then you go into anger, and that can exhibit itself in lots of different ways, where you might experience insomnia. And it's not just you who's angry, so the people that you're dealing with also might be angry, so there might be some falling out. People tend to withdraw. So the anger phase can be a really challenging one to go through. And then there's depression, where there's this sort of sense of hopelessness, where you feel like, you do feel really unmotivated. And then there is sort of the glimmer of light, where you get to the bargaining phase, where you start seeing possibilities, exploring alternatives, maybe I'll take part-time work on, maybe I'll, you start sort of negotiating a little. And then finally, the end is in sight when you get to the acceptance phase, which isn't really sort of embracing the new life, but it's acknowledging that the past is gone, and accepting that there's a new reality ahead of you. So potentially sounds a little bit bleak, but I want to offer hope really here. What can you do to counterbalance this? And what you can do is, think about how you can build up your resilience. And resilience it's your ability to bounce back when things aren't going the way you'd hoped they'd go. And it's a skill that we all have. And it's just that the stronger it is, the more you're like that little character where you bounce straight back up and nothing really bothers you. And so, building your resilience is a really important thing to do. And there's lots of ways you can do that. And it's worth noting that it's a multifaceted thing. There's a physical aspect to it where it's looking after yourself physically. So it's eating well, it's making sure you get enough sleep, it's staying active, because that helps us think clearly and keeps us healthy and strong. And that's a really good foundation for resilience. But on the mental side, it's about making sure that you're mentally active. So even if you're, between jobs, it's taking on mental challenges. It's keeping the sort of, the channels moving, because it keeps you thinking flexibly. And that's, the skill that we need, in our day jobs, as well as, of being able to weigh up options, plan ahead, solve problems. So it's really important to focus on that. For the emotional point of view, and I have some suggestions for that in a minute, it's maintaining a positive view of yourself so that you feel confident about your strengths and your abilities. And you can also manage the strong feelings that you might have. And we were talking about the anger phase. So the more resilient you are, the less the anger phase really will impact you. And from a social point of view, it's making sure that you have strong relationships. It could be with family or friends or mentors, because there's a lot of research that says if you have a best friend as an adult, that can help you really bounce back when things don't go your way. So I have to share 5 ways that you can become more resilient. And I've mapped it loosely to the model I showed you before, but it's effectively, I'll just talk them through and then I'll share them with you. So it's about sort of giving yourself a boost and making you feel, when you reflect on yourself, making you feel confident about yourself and feel that you've got a lot to offer. It's for the anger, it's about sort of quieting the sort of negative thoughts in your head and not allowing them to really overwhelm you. It's about finding your purpose so that you feel that you've got some focus. Things may not be going well now, but you know what you're here for, and that gives you a kind of a future to look forward to. And the silver linings is really about, every cloud has got a silver lining, and are you able to really look for that? And then last but not least is a little exercise that helps you really just find, when you need it, just find that energy boost of confidence. And I'll share that with you. Oh, nope, I'm sorry. Right, so the first one is about giving yourself a boost. And it's about making sure that you are able to see yourself in a positive light, because seeing yourself well can really have a huge impact on your health and your outlook generally. There's a ton of research that supports this. This is not just a sort of it sounds like the sort of thing anybody might say, but actually it's really backed up by research. And it's so one thing that I do with my clients is I ask them for a week to set a reminder before they go to sleep and to write down 3 things. They can be the most trivial things, but 3 things that went well that day or gave you or maybe someone else pleasure. So 3 things where you contributed to making the world a slightly better place. And what I find is that when I see them about 7 days later and I ask them how they are, they're grinning from ear to ear. It's one of those things that it sounds really trivial, but it can actually make you feel really good. And it's definitely one of those things that you need when things aren't going well, to just sort of feeling good makes you feel more confident and more positive about, what potentially could happen in the future. Now, my second recommendation is a well-worn recommendation. We've all heard that we need to be more mindful and we need to do, more meditation. But there's a lot of research to suggest that if you do meditate, and here I say, there's a statistic that if you've meditated or been mindful for 1.5 hours, it can actually, we can now look at people's brains and realize that it's actually had an impact structurally on their brains. You don't have to do the 1.5 hours straight. It's just, it's a cumulative process, and you might find it easy to use the kind of apps like Calm or Headspace to create a sort of mindful moments. Because it really it helps you be detached from yourself and your thoughts, and that can really make you see what's going on in your life, make it appear to be less stressful for you. And there's research to suggest that it can keep illnesses like cancer at bay. So another tool that I use a lot with clients is help them find their purpose. There's a lot of ways you can do it. You'll have probably heard of Simon Sinek and his Find Your Why book. I find that's a really fascinating book, and I recommend everybody read it, but I find that it's not as actionable as using the Ikigai model, which is loosely based on sort of Japanese thinking, which is where you explore what you love, what you're good at, and what the world needs. And what's interesting is the sort of the sweet spot in the middle is it helps you understand what drives you out of bed in the morning. What really could you spend all your time doing and get lost in the flow of it? And once you understand that, what I've noticed with my clients is it becomes a kind of a compass for their lives. Once they see it, it helps them really steer where to go next and where not to go next. And in times like this, that's really helpful, knowing kind of where your long-term vision is. And there's research to suggest that it really has a terrific impact on your life. And the bit I find really fascinating is that it helps keep Alzheimer's at bay, which is quite an attractive outcome. I talked a little earlier about silver linings, and it's easy when things aren't going well for us to get absorbed in the negative stories that we tell ourselves. And it's important to stop and try and turn that around, because anything that happens to us has some gift hidden inside it. It's either something we learn, that was terrible, I'll never do that again. Or, you find that, a job doesn't work out and then the next job you have is really brilliant. So, bad things don't always lead to more bad things. And, getting a state of mind where you look for the gift and opportunity in an experience you have is really important. And so I've certainly spoken to people over the kind of coronavirus time where, people have been furloughed and found that they were able to focus on things that they loved that they didn't have time to do before. And so even in the worst of circumstances, there are silver linings, and it's worth reminding ourselves about the good and hidden inside some things that initially seem bad. And last but not least is power posing. So Amy Cuddy, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, discovered that we can change our state of mind by physically changing our physical position. And so what she recommends is, and this is for anybody who has an interview coming up, and it's really great now that we're remote, you can just, you know, make sure the camera's not on, and you just adopt a really strong, like, superhero pose, or the type of pose that you might have if you just won an Olympic gold medal. You know, it's like arms out, celebratory, you know, or arms wide. And what's amazing about it is, and you have to hold that, apologies, for 2 minutes, and that will, the impact that'll have is that it'll make you feel confident, and you'll come across as more confident. And that's, it's really powerful, and anybody who's tried it will definitely try it again. And I just wanted to say as well that it's worth remembering that life is full of ups and downs. Just in terms of our industry, if you think of the sort of digital industry, I know this is a wider audience, but even in terms of the economy, say, you know, when I, my first experience of an economic downturn was when the dot-com bubble burst. And there wasn't, you know, people went from thinking they were going to be millionaires overnight to having absolutely no work. And that lasted for, it felt like forever, but it was definitely a year or two that there really wasn't, people were really scrabbling around for work. And then we have the sort of the 2008 crisis, and it sort of feels like, you know, it's once every sort of 10 or so years, there's an economic crisis, and you know, there is life after economic crises, but when you're in the middle of one, it feels like it's just never going to end, and this is going to be it. And so I just wanted to, you know, mention that. And so in order to bounce back well, in order to not have this thing be a defining moment for you in your career and your life, you know, becoming more resilient is the way forward, because it makes you calmer, you're more resourceful, you're more creative about figuring out how to get around it, and more tenacious. And, you know, those are all the qualities you need to weather the storm, because the storm will eventually pass. And I love to leave everyone with a quote. And I thought, you know, we all have a lot of respect for Nelson Mandela, and he invites us not to judge him by his success, but judge him by how many times he fell down and got back up again. And really, you know, I think that's you know, if he can do it, we can all do it. And so that's me. I just, before I finish, I just want to say that I have an offer. If anyone who's connected with me on LinkedIn will know this, but I have an offer that anyone who's having a tough time during the crisis, I'm happy to spend an hour with them and help them try and unpick, you know, the things that are on the top of their mind. So here's the way to contact me if you're interested. I would love to see if I can help you navigate your way through the crazy times that we're going through. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. Yeah, it was a really, really good talk, full of good things to get inspired, and a few tips that really every day we all need. Yeah, especially in these times. So actually, Jason, you have a question to Liz about this kind of tips and techniques. Do you want to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I do. Thanks to you both. Actually, I thought the talks were excellent. So, yeah, Liz, I appreciate a lot of the advice there, but I always find it's difficult getting it built into your routine, and I think that's the hardest thing. You know, I've been told, you know, you can. The hardest thing about starting a yoga practice is rolling your mat. So what are your tips in terms of actually getting these things built into your, you know, routine and your lifestyle?
Great question. I refer everyone to a researcher. I'm not sure where he is. I think he's at Stanford, PJ Fogg, and he writes about, and I think he's just written a book called Tiny Habits, but you can find a lot of his stuff on the internet. And what he recommends is that you sort of associate one, you pick a tiny habit that you want to introduce, the unrolling of the mat or whatever it is, and you tag it on to something that is already a habit for you. So, for example, if you want to do, well, exactly that. So you say, after I finish brushing my teeth, I will just unroll the mat. I don't have to do anything else. I just do that. And what he finds is that once you've got the mat unrolled, you're going to get started. But the focus and the commitment that you make is just to tie the new habit in a very, very tiny way to the old habit. And he's found, and there's, like I say, there's a lot of research and even a book on the subject to indicate that it's a very successful way to build new habits. So I hope that helps. I'd love to know if it works for you.
Yeah, cheers. I'm familiar with that. Yeah, BJ Fogg. I think that there's Dave Brailsford based a lot of what he did with the cycling team, the Sky cycling team, around that sort of marginal gains and incremental sort of baby steps and that. Cool. That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So I've looking back through the questions, there was some for Dave around co-working spaces. I'm just trying to find them again, actually.
That was mine, actually.
No, that's your question, Carmen. Go for it.
Yeah, I think it was mine. It's just because I actually like working from home. I found it quite interesting because I never thought I will, but I do. But sometimes I feel the need of a different space, or even like I was thinking, even like, let's say I will go back to the office, and it will be nice not necessarily go to an office. Sometimes offices are in places that are too far from me, but I actually like the idea of going in an office. And when I think about, oh, well, maybe a co-working space could be a good idea, but then I am a freelancer, I work for different companies. And my question was like, can you work in a co-working space? What about the privacy issues? What about, like, you know, I'm having meetings with people all the time and talking about a project, and somehow I feel, yeah, I cannot go to a co-working space even if I would love to go. Do you know, is any solution for that?
You're on mute, Dave.
Yeah, great question, and I'm gonna post a link to my paper and a link to an article, but I'll give you a couple of short answers. So, you know, one of the things that I'm hearing from my research during COVID-19 is that whether people kind of like have a preference for working in the office or a preference for working from home, and most people do, kind of veer. What I'm hearing from almost everybody is that they want a hybrid strategy. So they, you know, and working from home when everybody's working from home during lockdown is not the same as normal remote work. I think, you know, we've learned what it's like when no one is in the office. It's, you know, it's not great all the time. There are different types of co-working spaces. So one of the things that really confounded me in my research, I went all the way to Thailand. I went to this amazing tropical island, and I went into a co-working space, and it was exactly like a university library. No one was speaking. The idea that you would pick up the phone and have an out loud conversation, I mean, was totally taboo. So, you know, people would kind of like, if you wanted to have a conversation with somebody in the co-working space, you'd have to try and message them on the Slack channel, and then you'd kind of like go outside into the garden or somewhere else and have a conversation. You know, asking this question about, you know, why go to a co-working space when you're trying to escape the office? One question was outsourcing, you know, your discipline, and you know, I didn't fully answer that question before, because there's this idea of maybe performing productivity kind of comes into it sometimes, and I've done that as a student. But one of the other things that people say, if they find you know, a nice quiet co-working space or a buzzy co-working space, whichever vibe you're going for, what people tend to say is they just want to be around other people that are working. You just get this forward momentum from just being around this kind of like buzz of other people working. You're not going to go to a playground with kids screaming with a laptop, you know, to do your working. And there is actually a psychological concept called co-presence, and there's been, you know, there's a whole, you know, sort of tranche of literature that has been written about this. So if you find that you can't get stuff done from home and you want to go to a local coffee shop or you want to go to a co-working space, you can say, yeah, I want a little bit of co-presence today. And you know, so I think you were kind of maybe sort of like I'm hinting at that, Carmen. So I think we just need to have this toolkit of different strategies that we can tap into.
Thank you.
Great. I actually had another one on co-working, so I might just go ahead with that. So basically, I was just reading many articles in these days and the news around the coming back to the office. So a lot of companies are actually thinking of cutting spaces in their offices to accommodate more working from home in the future. In this kind of concept, if actually this will happen, how would you see the co-working spaces sort of working or maybe changing in the future after the pandemic, if there is any changes or if there is anything that you might have found in your studies?
Yeah, so I mean, you know, co-working space, you know, to some people the term is quite novel and quite new. To some people they've heard about it a long time. The term originated in the, you know, just after 2000, around that time, and really became popularized over the last 10 years. So it's a very broad category. There are lots of different types of co-working spaces. There are ones that you go to where there are very strict rules about being very quiet. Then you have big investor brands like WeWork, who call themselves co-working spaces. I've spoken to a lot of owners of smaller co-working spaces, and they get quite bristled and kind of like quite upset by WeWork referring to themselves as co-working spaces. I actually went to a presentation that they gave about the future of work and the future of co-working spaces about 3 years ago. And they were talking about being a creative hub for freelancers. And then when I went and spoke to them, I said, oh yeah, I'd really be interested in speaking to some of these kind of like creative communities of practice that are happening in co-working spaces. And they said, well, actually that doesn't really happen because we just lease all of our office space out to Facebook. So, you know, that they're really just Regis, you know, with hipster branding. So let's just discount them as co-working spaces. Sorry if anyone from WeWork is on here, but, you know, I think that you need to come up with a better business idea. And there are going to be lots of different brands of co-working spaces, I think, coming out. And I think one of the challenges, in an article that I wrote about a month ago, I did say that co-working spaces were going to find, you know, their place on the high street because a lot of other businesses are going to close down. But a lot of co-working spaces are small businesses. So, you know, as we come out of the long tail of lockdown, and the long tail is a lot longer than we thought it was going to be, you know, after the original, you know, 12 weeks that we all thought at the beginning. You know, some of those businesses, you know, may survive, but, you know, some may not. So I think, you know, the question is is really a longer term question about what's going to happen to some of these retail spaces on the high streets. We've already kind of like seen, restaurants kind of repurpose themselves as greengrocers and all of that kind of stuff. So it's a big long conversation, and there may even be a new term that kind of, you know, overrides the use of the word co-working space that comes out of this.
Great, thanks.
John, I don't know if Dave's answer about co-working answered your question at all, or if you wanted to re-ask it. Any comment? No. John mentioned about the co-working space, the analog. We used to some students study in the library, which I think you kind of mentioned in your comments.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm going to answer that just using, you know, digital nomads as an example, because you know, this idea of freedom and traveling around the world and going, you know, to Thailand, Bali, you know, Medellin, there's lots of different places that people are going to now. It feels like this liberating journey of freedom, but it does become quite isolating and lonely over time. And you know, sometimes and you know, some research participants on my study have been quite honest once I developed rapport with them, and kind of like said, you know, I didn't really feel that I could do any work today, or that I wanted to do any work, but I did go in and it was a bit of a productivity performance. So, you know, fake it till you make it, smile, you know, kind of like till you actually feel happy. You know, so that, you know, that does go on sometimes, and I'm sure that happens in university libraries as well. But you're not going to go into a co-working space or a library, you know, every day if it's all a performance. And, you know, one of the things that has been really interesting that I have found with digital nomads that have stayed the course, they've stayed, you know, beyond the first year, they're not the 90% that go home. They do tend to go into co-working spaces quite a lot, maybe not every day, but you know, they do need an ergonomic chair, they need a second monitor. You know, they may be a graphic designer and the other people around them may be, you know, computer coders or book editors. But, you know, they do actually want somebody just to kind of like speak to about, you know, some of their working practices sometimes. So, yeah, and that links back to the idea of co-presence again. Some of the people, some of the nomads that have done better are people that, couples that are traveling together and working. There is such a term, which is called couplepreneur. When I first heard that term, I thought, oh, okay, you know, that's interesting. But, you know, if you are sitting and working with someone and they get up and they have a break and you have lunch together, they remind you to have breaks. They help you impose some structure into your day. And I've been hearing those stories time and time again during COVID. So you know, it's good to be with other people and you get into their working patterns. And then if you have too many people around you, that's disruptive. And one of the things I have heard repeatedly in my recent research is I really miss the office, but I don't miss open plan offices. So that's been really interesting. So, you know, I mean, one of the coping strategies for that are really good noise cancelling headphones if you can afford them. So, you know, that's just one example.
Yeah, funny enough, the place where I work, they offer a refund, a certain amount of money for noise cancelling headphones. We're in an open plan. I hate it. Quite enjoying being at home.
Yeah, I think what I would just say about all of these things is these things can be paradoxical and true at the same time. So you can simultaneously hate the idea of the office and really need one, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So.
If anyone has a question, they can raise their hand as well. I'm going to ask one around employment law and HR practices. I wondered, just in terms of, you know, adopting this nomad life and the working from home, it feels like they're very much out of step. You know, we're well aware the legal profession takes the time to catch up. Do you know how they're responding to this, and do you think that they're partly to blame for a lack of flexibility for the workers?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I'm actually writing a paper on this at the moment. I mean, this varies from country to country. I actually only read yesterday that because people are traveling less, people are actually changing their immigration rules. So Barbados are changing their immigration, their visa on arrival, so that you can stay for longer and remote work from there, because they don't have any tourists at the moment. So that's an interesting kind of reflex action. Some people may have heard of the Estonia residency scheme, where anybody can you know, kind of like set up as an e-resident in Estonia. And you know, Skype was based out of Estonia, and I've been through the process myself. It's quite easy, and then you can set up a business there. And then they did that quite a few years ago. They did that successfully, and then they talked about setting up a digital nomad visa, which I believe they've kind of done a soft launch of in the last few weeks. Now, the whole idea of the digital nomad visa is that you would apply. And I don't know what the restrictions are from applying, but it would then give you access to the Schengen zone. Now, in this conversation of Brexit and borders and, you know, closing down all of that stuff, I don't know how that's going to play out. But there is this, you know, I mean, Diogenes 2,000 years ago proclaimed himself the citizen of, you know, of the world. And then we had Theresa May kind of saying, if you're a, you know, citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You know, so, you know, we're living in a time where we simultaneously have globalization and we have people trying to kind of like build walls and borders. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens. That was the reason why I actually started to study digital nomads in the first place. I didn't think I'd end up like being sucked into this kind of like remote work, you know, kind of detour, which has been endlessly fascinating, but that was what I was trying to find out. And one of the things that I have found out in the research as I've, you know, caught up with digital nomads is that most of them have gone home because they've needed to access their healthcare systems and you know, things like furlough schemes and, you know, sort of like, you know, getting paid so that they can feed themselves. You know, the nation state is, you know, has been rejected as an idea by digital nomads, but it's an idea that is refusing to die immediately.
Cool, thank you.
Great. So do we have any other questions, or do we want to maybe open a sort of conversation? We have still a few minutes. If we then have a sort of conversation, we might just be able to stay another 5 to 10 minutes, and then we can close the meetup. So please raise your hands, or maybe put up the camera if you want to. Maybe I've got another question for you, Dave, and it was like we touched a few downs points during your talk of like working remotely, and what are the pains that these digital nomads are actually going through. And I was wondering, what are the ups and maybe like the couple of two sort of current ups that are always kind of finding out, and you're always finding out during research.
Sorry, could you just repeat the middle of that question? I just missed that.
What kind of ups do you find within your research that are coming through? If there are.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, you know, one of the things that I learned that really works well for digital nomads, and I think this goes for all remote workers. I mean, it's a little bit more complex now that so many people are working remotely. But the people that did really well being digital nomads they tended to be the freelancers with very defined skills. So, you know, they were already really great designers, really great coders, and they'd been working in their hometowns, you know, sort of like networking, going to things like this, building a client base, and having, you know, in-person meetings. And then once they kind of like got to this, you know, kind of like place of, they had these reserves of resilience, they had a client base, they had a really defined skill and community of practice, then they could go away and they knew that they could get the work done. They knew how to do a deadline. They, you know, knew that they could kind of like work in one place and then move to another. You know, when it becomes more difficult is when people try to set up businesses or try to learn skills while they're, you know, remote working. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest things that comes out of this massive remote work and working from home experiment, working from home. People are talking about the lack of serendipity. So, you know, if we have like mini meetups or conferences, it's really nice. You can sign up, it's great. You can kind of like say, I want to go and see that talk, and that talk. But, you know, how do you then have that, you know, sort of like chance conversation, you know, sort of like over an olive and, you know, a glass of lemonade or a glass of wine, you know, afterwards, and then bump into somebody that you wouldn't normally speak to. You know, I said right at the beginning of this in some of the interviews that I gave, I think that the office is going to be seen as a luxury that some people aspire to. And, you know, there are quite a few businesses that are actually, you know, they've already, you know, got rid of their leases, and that's going to be something that's not going to be open, you know, to people. So I think the way forward, the positive way forward, is how do we get these hybrid, you know, kind of like working from home and going and having these face-to-face interactions when they're not going to always be available to us. Because I think the ideal scenario, you know, even for digital nomads or, you know, during COVID-19, is to have some kind of hybridity, some kind of like in-person communication, and, you know, and then the ability to work from home and have your productivity day where you power through tasks, you know, and able to pick up the kids from school and all of that kind of stuff.
Definitely, thank you. Does anyone have another question or wants to start a conversation?
If no one has a question, I have one, but
yeah,
I leave.
Go on.
If anyone else have a question, I will leave them.
I think it's your turn, Karen.
Okay, it's for Liz. I was thinking about I really like this, the 5 stages of grief that you had. And I was thinking how much I can see myself in some situations. I have gone through all of those stages, but one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about it, for example, things like anger or depression, is we live in a world at the moment where we cannot talk about this. It's like almost like taboo, like you cannot be angry, you cannot be depressed. It's like, and I was thinking somehow it seems by that, you know, 5 stages, you need to go through the stages. So what happened when somehow you're not allowed to be angry or be depressed?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think it's difficult, and that's what I find, you know, when I coach people is encourage them to acknowledge what it is that they're going through. I mean, if you do feel angry, you know, and certainly people do, and when things don't go well in their life and their career, and I think it's useful to acknowledge that. But you're right, in society we are, and Dave touched on that as well, that our society encourages us to kind of put our best foot forward and always create a really, you know, the best version of ourselves. And I think he had an example of someone who their Instagram life is better than their own life, and so that can really negatively impact you, I think, if you're constantly trying to live up to the fake life that you've presented everyone as having. But I think the point is we need to be as honest with ourselves as we can, and when, you know, work out a safe environment to express what we're feeling. You know, I personally think absolutely, because it's true, if you are feeling, you know, angry or depressed, then you know, it's about having that support network and having people who can, you know, you can reveal that side of yourself to. I think it's really important, and it's sort of one of the factors of resilience, is that you do have that social support. So yeah. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So if there aren't any more questions, I think we actually finished our time as well. So I would like to again thank Dave and Liz for their great talks. for the conversation we had, and it was really, really good. You can actually get in touch with the links and the sort of contacts they shared. The recording will be posted on our YouTube channel, as I said earlier. And we look forward to seeing you to the next event, which will be on the 10th of August. And we are actually preparing others for the autumn as well. So stay tuned. And thank you for participating tonight. And stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.